Hello, my name's Rob Trickler, and I'm the owner of All County Evictions and the law office of Rob Trickler. Without question, my staff spends more time on the phone dealing with issues about notices than anything else involving evictions. So I'm going to spend some time trying to explain the notice procedures so that you can go through this at your convenience, educate yourself on the do's and don'ts and notices, and make sure that your lawsuit for an eviction, or unlawful detainer as we call it, starts off properly. Now this is important because notices are the foundation of your lawsuit. They start it all, everything's built on them, and unfortunately the notice is one of the most strictly complied with requirements. There's wiggle room in the other parts of your unlawful detainer or eviction procedure, but there's very little wiggle room in the notice. It simply has to be done right. T's have to be crossed, I's have to be dotted, and if you don't, you just haven't started the lawsuit properly. It's not something you can recover from without starting over. So it's very important to get it right the first time. Now, to that end, you can get notices on my website. If you go to allcountyevictionsonline.com, again, that's allcountyevictionsonline.com, we provide the notices for free. I do this because you can find anything on the web these days. Unfortunately, it's just not stuff frequently that's specific to Washington, and it hasn't been vetted well. You'd be surprised how many times I find people that are trying to use documents from New York or New Jersey or Arizona in Washington State, and it simply isn't appropriate. It won't get you started. So, I just as soon give them away for free. We'd be happy to do them for you too. But those notices have been vetted, they've been tested, we like them, they're successful, and we would encourage you to use those notices. Now, the first step is to know which notice you need to use. It's not as simple as that might sound. Now, if you're trying to collect rents and you're not in a mobile home park situation, you're going to use a 3-day notice to pay or vacate. However, if you're using an MLS document and you haven't changed it, MLS defaults to 5-day notices. Now, you don't have to give 5 days in a residential landlord-tenant situation, but if your contract is an MLS or something similar and gives 5 days or more, you have to give the 5 days notice. You're obligated to that. The other situation I mentioned, a mobile home. If you have a mobile home park, and that means 2 or more spaces for rent where the tenant owns the trailer on top of the land which you own, then you're under the landlord-tenant, the Mobile Home Act, which requires 5 days notice to pay rent or vacate. Now, anything not rents, and this includes late fees. People frequently make this mistake. Late fees, it's really a toss-up whether the court's going to allow late fees that are related to rent to come in on a 3-day notice or not. But if they don't, it's defective. You can't simply just not collect on them later. Your notice will actually be defective. So it's a much safer situation to go ahead and do your late fees on a 10-day notice. You would do the same for unpaid utilities, NSF fees. Anything that's money related that's not rents belongs properly on a 10-day notice to comply or vacate. Now, the other notice is a 20-day notice to terminate. Now, that's not really 20 days. It should just be a notice to terminate. That's how we refer to it. Because it's not just 20 calendar days. It's a minimum of 20 days, but it must end on the last day of your rental period. So if you rent month to month, or even on a lease where it's rent is due the first of the month, then the last day of the month is the end of your rental period. Now, if you started your lease or rental agreement in mid-month and didn't prorate it, and the rent's due 15th of the month or some other day, then the 14th of the month would be the last day of the rental period, and that's when you must end the tenancy. So it's 20 days and ending on the last day of the rental period. Now, check your contract. I frequently see contracts that for some reason, perhaps they got them online, they didn't vet them, or they got them handed to them through somebody who didn't know any better. But a contract will frequently give, as I said, additional time and additional requirements with regard to your notices. I've seen them give up to 30 days notice. And despite the fact that Washington state law says you only have to give your tenant 3 days to pay the rent or vacate, if your contract says 30-day notice, then unfortunately you're obligated to give your tenant 30 days to pay the rent. Well, when you've checked your contract and you've got the appropriate period of time, then you need to understand that you have to give an additional 1 day if you end up posting and mailing your notice as opposed to personal service. That's required by statute. So you wouldn't count the day that you give your notice to your tenant. The day after that is day one. But if you end up posting it conspicuously on the door and mailing it because they weren't home or wouldn't come to the door, or for whatever reason you couldn't get them personally served, then you must add 1 additional day. Keep that in mind. If you are ending this tenancy on a notice to terminate and you're ending it on the last day of the rental period and you're not sure whether you're going to get it personally served, don't cut yourself short and go with 21 days, because if you hand it to them with 21 days left, you don't count today, you count tomorrow as day one. You've got 20 days precisely, but if you post it and mailed, you have to give them that extra day, and you're a day short, and your notice won't be sufficient. Now, if you have Section 8, there's a couple of caveats here. This is new case law, but the Section 8 tenants are entitled to know the reason for the termination of tenancy on a 20-day. That's not the case anywhere else except in Seattle, the city of Seattle, or a Section 8 tenant. Anywhere else in the state, or anyone else, you're not required to give a reason. You can simply terminate. 10-day notices for Section 8s are even more problematic. If they're for money to pay a utility, for example, or pay a late fee, or pay an SF fee, that's pretty simple, because the reason's in there and the date the notice or would terminate the tenancy if it's not complied with is in there. But if it's for a behavioral modification issue, let's just say smoking. You've got a non-smoking contract with your tenant. It's a non-smoking unit, and you know they're smoking, and you gave them a 10-day notice to stop smoking, then you have to put some language in your 10-day that says your tenancy terminates as of the date of your next violation. It's not simple, but the federal law, as interpreted by Washington State Division I Court of Appeals, says that they are entitled to know the date the tenancy terminates. Well, unfortunately, you don't know when the next date of their violation is going to be, so you've got to put some generic language in there that lets them know that the next time they light up or violate the contract in whichever way, that's the date of the termination. Now, we don't recommend 10-day notices. They're very easy to defeat because they only require substantial performance, which means your tenant only has to get started on fixing the problem. But especially with Section 8, now, the Court of Appeals has decided that any behavior modification, with the exception of paying those fees we talked about, is a question of fact which can't be decided at a show cause hearing. What that means is, if you're going to give your tenant a 10-day notice to correct some behavior, let's go back to the smoking example, to stop smoking, you're not going to be able to win this at a show cause hearing. You're going to actually have to have a trial, which is going to be for the purpose of determining whether smoking in a non-smoking unit is a substantial enough violation of your contract to warrant its termination. Trials are time-consuming and they're expensive. Now, if you can at all avoid this 10-day notice for a behavior modification, or somehow turn it into a pay or vacate type situation, you're much better off doing so. For example, let's say your tenant is destroying the screens in your house. Rather than give a 10-day notice to repair the screens, you may be better off repairing the screens yourself and then giving them a 10-day notice to pay you, to compensate you for those screens. It's going to be a much more decisive way to deal with the problem.